Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 28 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to break down some difficult Dynasty decisions. So whether it's from a startup, from a trade negotiation standpoint, or just flat out who you would rather have on your roster, we've taken a look at a number of different players that are being drafted in similar ranges, and we're going to discuss who we would rather have, what the general consensus is from the Dynasty community, and take a look back at some of the results from the Dynasty War Room Listener League, which had its startup draft finish up over the past couple of weeks. And so we have some interesting takeaways from that I want to discuss today as well. As always, if you've missed any of our previous shows, you can find them on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, pretty much anywhere that podcasts can be found. Make sure that you give us a follow on your platform of choice, leave us a 5-star review, and give us a follow on Twitter at Dynasty War Room. Interact with us there. We're going to have all sorts of questions and polls and fun things throughout the season. So go give us a follow there. And subscribe on YouTube as well. Eventually, we will be doing some more video content, but for now, we're going to focus on the audio-only format, and I think that covers just about everything. So let's just go ahead and jump right into today's show. And kick things off, I have 8 different questions that I'm going to pose to you, the listener, and these are all going to be player debates that stem from the Dynasty startup draft that the Listener League just completed. And so these are all real scenarios where, people had to answer these questions in real time on the clock. So we want to take a look at how these dilemmas turned out, because you might be faced with similar decisions moving forward. And I think they're all pretty interesting debates. So I tweeted all 8 of these player scenarios and asked you, the Twitter population, what your thoughts were, who you would prefer in these scenarios as well. So we're going to talk about that as well. And our first question of the day is simply who you would rather start a Dynasty startup draft with. So through 2 rounds, what quarterback wide receiver combo, would you prefer to begin a startup draft? And first was Lamar Jackson with A.J. Brown. Those players were taken with the 5th pick and the 20th pick in the draft. The second group of players, Justin Jefferson with Justin Herbert. That was me. I took those players with the 6th pick and the 19th pick in the startup draft. Joe Burrow, Amon-Ra St. Brown. They went at the 1-2 turn, right at picks 12 and 13 in our startup. And then Caleb Williams and Marvin Harrison Jr., who went at 11 and 14. So 4 very different builds, really, to start a Dynasty league with. I mean, Caleb Williams and Marvin Harrison Jr. going the all-rookie route sets that team up for, a very interesting next few years, because you got those 2 very young players, sky-high potential, being talked about as potentially the best quarterback and wide receiver to come into the league in quite some time. So that certainly can be intriguing, but again, a little bit more risk, because, rookies are just naturally a little bit more risky, but you could end up with 2 guys that in a year or 2 from now are both, top 5 picks in startups. So it's kind of a high ceiling, low floor type of play. You have the, win now superstars with Lamar Jackson, A.J. Brown, but A.J. Brown, the oldest player of this group, so that's a consideration. Justin Herbert and Justin Jefferson is the lone scenario where the wide receiver was taken first. I decided to go with Jefferson at the 106 rather than take a quarterback. And Joe Burrow went at the back of the first round with Amon-Ra St. Brown, which I think is really great value at that spot to get a top 4 receiver and one of those upper echelon quarterbacks. So Twitter said with a 42% mark that they preferred the Joe Burrow, Amon-Ra St. Brown duo compared to those other 3 sets of players. Justin Herbert and Justin Jefferson was second with 23%. Lamar Jackson, A.J. Brown third with 19%. And then the rookie duo with Williams and Harrison checking in at 16%. So pretty solid spread. No overwhelming majority, but pretty healthy lead there for the Burrow-St. Brown combo. And I have to say that I would agree. I think getting, a top quarterback, I think once you get past that first group of, 4 or 5 guys, there is a bit of a, group where you could order them in a number of different ways, and I think everything turns out okay for you. But I don't think there's any debate that Joe Burrow is still a top 10 dynasty quarterback. And so to be able to land that with the last pick in the first round of a super flex draft, and then pairing him with my wide receiver 3 overall, but somebody who's pretty consensusly viewed as a top 4 guy in St. Brown, I think that is really, really good value to be able to get at the 112 and the 201. And so I'm not surprised one bit that Twitter agreed with that. My rationale for going Justin Jefferson in the first round, that decision for me came down to Jefferson versus CeeDee Lamb. I went back and forth over that decision before ultimately deciding to go Jefferson. I was a little bit worried about the CeeDee Lamb contract situation, and I just think that Justin Jefferson is someone that can do it regardless of how well the quarterback play is on his team. We've seen him, we saw him at the end of last year perform very well without Kirk Cousins, and I'm a J.J. McCarthy believer, so I don't think that the quarterback play will actually be that poor. But again, I just felt it was a situation where he got the contract, felt a little bit lower risk to me than Lamb, who really kind of only did it for, just last year. Granted, it was, of course, an incredible season, but, I don't think there was a bad call to make there in that spot. But then Justin Herbert was there for me with the 19th pick coming back. That actually was a difficult choice as well. I was going back and forth between Herbert, Jordan Love, and Kyler Murray. And, of course, news came out about Herbert's foot injury a few days after the completion of our draft. So, unfortunate there for me. We'll see if I regret that. But I'm still a Justin Herbert believer, and so I felt pretty good about that duo. I love the 2024 upside for the Lamar Jackson, A.J. Brown combo. A.J. Brown is somebody that, yes, he's starting to get up there in age, but he's still, he just signed a new contract. He still has at least, 2 to 3 years left at least of being a top tier elite wide receiver. And then, we all know that Lamar Jackson can be a really good fantasy quarterback with his rushing upside. And I appreciate the willingness to go with the 1-2 rookie picks there at 11 and 14 overall. I think that's a bold move. I think it could absolutely pay off. And it, sort of sets things up for, this year, the first year of the league, a bit of a, building year for that team. And they could end up with one of those true, heavyweight dynasty teams over the next few years if both of those picks hit. So with that being said, let's jump on over to our second question, and that was a simple, who would you rather have on your roster between Drake London and Chris Olave? Now, these two players went back-to-back in the third round of the startup. Chris Olave went at the 309. Drake London went at the 310. And I actually was trying to trade up on our draft right around this range to select Drake London. So London is who I prefer of these two players, and that is also who Twitter prefers, but barely. 51% to 49% London over Olave. It was actually literally only one vote separating these two players. So I think the fact that they went back-to-back is spot on. And we've talked a bit about Drake London throughout the offseason, but I view him as somebody that has just the potential is really off the charts. We've seen Chris Olave been very good. He's been a solid, steady player, but he is stuck with bad quarterback play with Derek Carr on a mediocre offense with the Saints. And I think he's an extremely talented player, but I think the ceiling is higher for Drake London. So even though London maybe hasn't been as good from a production standpoint as Olave to this point in their career, the ceiling is higher for London. He's got Kirk Cousins now in Atlanta, and I think that this is the year that he takes that step forward to be a solid top 10 dynasty wide receiver. He's so young. He was a really good prospect coming out, top 10 pick in the draft. So a close vote, but I would go with London here. London was my target in this area of the draft. I was not able to make that move happen. Instead, I stayed put in the 4th round and took Nico Collins. But still, Drake London, Chris Olave, an interesting question there. And, part of these dynasty decisions that people have to make, it's, we're documenting this so we can look back and see, this is how we feel at the time about these players. This is the general consensus. But everything changes so quickly in Dynasty, so we'll see how, these picks look in a few seasons from now. But moving on to number 3, Brock Bowers or Kyle Pitts on your roster. Who would you prefer? These two players went back-to-back in the 4th round of our startup draft, and Brock Bowers went at the 408, and Kyle Pitts went at the 409. Twitter preferred Brock Bowers by a 57% to 43% margin. And some added, context. We, were wondering during the draft, would the team that has Caleb Williams and Marvin Harrison go for Brock Bowers in the 4th round, or, make a move to really go with, the all rookie team, because they did go with Rome Odunze in the 3rd round. They did not do so. These were different teams that landed these 2 tight ends. There was a bit of a tight end run that began in this 4th round. So we had Trey McBride go early in the 4th, followed by Kincaid, and then Bowers and Pitts. Kelsey Andrews went at the 4-5 turn. So, and then Sam Laporta had gone already in the back of the 2nd. So we had a bit of a tight end run. So I think that there was some, guys wanting to make sure that they did not lose out at the position. And Bowers and Pitts are 2 players that are, very, very highly thought of in the dynasty space. We have, sort of the new hotness with Brock Bowers, the, 1st round pick, versus the old hotness with Kyle Pitts, who's still very young, but is sort of in a renewed situation with Kirk Cousins in Atlanta and sort of the excitement there, and hopefully fully healthy after being hampered a bit by injuries last year. So Brock Bowers is somebody that the consensus went with Bowers here. I personally would prefer Kyle Pitts. Again, a very close call, as all of these questions should be. But to me, Pitts, at least in the short term, has the higher upside. I do think that there is significantly more risk with Kyle Pitts. So some of that can come down to roster construction if you're playing more to win this year versus down the line. The team that drafted Kyle Pitts, well, both of these teams are, in situations where I think they are expecting to win, now. The team that drafted Bowers is the same team that has Lamar Jackson, A.J. Brown, and the team that took Kyle Pitts has C.J. Stroud and Garrett Wilson. So, pretty solid cores for both teams. But I do prefer the upside of Pitts. I just think we've seen he is a superior athlete. He had a 1,000-yard season as a rookie, and the quarterback play in Atlanta was so bad that I think that's what has everyone so excited about Pitts and then Drake London this year, myself included. So that is my rationale, but Bowers is still perfectly fine in that range, should have a very bright future, but I am a little bit worried about the fact that the quarterback play with the Raiders this year should be subpar. So being somebody that likes to try to win right away coming out of a startup, I do tend to shy away from rookies, which can, be very good for your team because you avoid a lot of risk, but it also can limit your upside if you miss out on some of those guys that, explode. You decide to pass on Jamar Chase in the 5th or 6th a few years ago, and then he comes out and just, lights the world on fire, things like that. So, rookies are boom bust type of picks oftentimes, but you can also return some really good value if those players hit. Now, our 4th question of the day is another quarterback question. So we have Trevor Lawrence or Brock Purdy. Both of these players went back-to-back in the 3rd round. Purdy went at the 305. Trevor Lawrence went at the 306. and I was the one that took Trevor Lawrence at the 306, who's the player that I was targeting there. I was very excited when Brock Purdy went ahead of Trevor Lawrence. So that should tell you where my head is at with this dilemma. I personally prefer Lawrence. I think that he has the higher upside. I think that he just is simply the better quarterback. Now, Purdy is, of course, in a better system, and he will likely receive a big contract as well after this season, assuming things go well for San Francisco. But Trevor Lawrence got paid. He's locked in. He's got great weapons. Evan Ingram, Brian Thomas, Christian Kirk. It's a division that, as we move forward, there should be a lot of points scored with the new, revamped Tennessee offense. We have the Colts with Anthony Richardson, Houston, and CJ Stroud. So I think it's just a division that's going to be very competitive. Reminds me a little bit of the NFC North in a way. Maybe not quite as much scoring, but just a good, solid division, a really good player. I think that a lot of the struggles last season for Trevor Lawrence can be blamed on him not being at full health and just, some of the injuries that were taking place on that team. So the jury is still out, of course. That's why these players, are going in the third and not the first or second. And Lawrence for a long time was going, earlier in drafts. But I have been very in on Lawrence all offseason. I've taken him in a number of leagues. I've acquired him where I can because I think now is probably the lowest point that his value will be for a while if he does what I expect him to do this season and be great. So by no means is that a knock on Purdy. I just was focused on Lawrence at this point. I think that Purdy is a fine mid-third round pick in a startup. And Twitter also saw this as very close. So 52% went with Trevor Lawrence versus 48% for Brock Purdy. So, pretty much a coin flip again here. So it seems like both managers got their guys, and that'll be an interesting situation to look back on at the end of the season. Next up, we have our first running back question. So we have Zach Moss or Chase Brown. Now, Moss and Brown also went back-to-back, like a lot of the questions from this show, but this was later on. This was in the 12th round. So we have Zach Moss went at the 12:06, and Chase Brown went at the 12:07, and this was an interesting point in the draft because this was a slow draft, 8-hour clock, and the news that Chase Brown was, taking the majority of snaps with the ones had just come out. I think it actually was right around the time that these picks were being made. So it was, pretty similar. It was these players were at the front of people's minds. Zach Moss did fall a little bit in this draft. So in a sense, I think it is pretty solid value for both, assuming that Moss has sort of that 50-50 role that I think people were expecting all throughout the offseason, myself included. However, I do think that the tide is starting to turn on this to favor Chase Brown as not just the better player to have from a long-term view, but potentially the short-term as well. It does seem like Brown might end up the starter and having a little bit more of a workload than I think people expected. So I have been telling you all offseason long throughout episodes that I preferred Chase Brown to Zach Moss at cost. So this is an interesting scenario in where the cost ended up being about the same because Moss did slip a little bit in the draft, potentially too because of the news that Chase Brown was working with the ones as training camp started. And 73% of Twitter responders voted for Chase Brown versus 27% for Zach Moss. So despite Moss going a pick ahead, being ranked significantly higher in the sleeper ADP list, Twitter agrees with me that Chase Brown is the better player to draft. I was the one here that did take Chase Brown, and I'm hoping that he'll be my RB3 for my team in this league. But by no means do I think that this was necessarily a bad pick to end up with Zach Moss. I think when you have a guy that's fallen, a round or so at least in a startup, it is very tempting to want to get that what feels like a value. And all offseason long, everyone's been saying, look, Zach Moss is probably going to be like the 60% of the carries type of guy. He's going to lead what we think will be a committee in a high-powered offense. And he certainly still could. I mean, this is not a situation where we absolutely know that Chase Brown is going to lead the way. But I do think it's a little bit riskier with Moss now that, the reports have not been great, or at least have not been in his favor so far in the month of August. But I'm very happy to land Chase Brown here at this spot. And, I think it's pretty consistent with what I have been telling you, that I would do. And, so I think it's important that when I can, I, try to back up my talk by securing the guys that, I believe in. So I was able to do that here, and we'll see how things shake out in the Cincinnati backfield. Now, number 6 is another interesting scenario involving rookies. So this time in the 7th round, we had 4 rookie wide receivers all go within a handful of picks of each other. Ladd McConkey went first at 702. Xavier Worthy went at 706. Brian Thomas Jr. went at the 708. And Keon Coleman went at the 709. So my question was simply, which of these players would you prefer to have on your roster the most? Would the results shake out to be the same order as they were drafted or not? Spoiler alert, I was involved with one of these picks, as has been the case for a few of these, but not every single one. And Twitter agreed with me. So I took Xavier Worthy at the 706, and 35% of voters in our poll voted that they would prefer to have Xavier Worthy on the rosters. But what I thought was very interesting was, and granted, it's roughly an even split among the other 3 players. However, Brian Thomas Jr. was second with 24%, and then McConkey and Coleman both tied with 20% of the vote. So interesting to see that. I do think there's, it probably depends on who your quarterback is, what your situation is. Interestingly enough, Ladd McConkey was a player I was targeting in this range because I had drafted Justin Herbert in the 2nd round. So I was hoping to be able to land that stack. That did not work out. So I was fortunate enough to have Worthy still on the board for me there at this pick. And he was my 5th receiver. So I went very wide receiver heavy in this draft, along with my 2 early quarterbacks with Herbert and Lawrence. So Xavier Worthy was my number 5 wide receiver for my roster. And the reason that I would have him first among this group, and this is, I felt this way before we had the news of, the Hollywood Brown injury. But Rashee Rice is there and had a very solid rookie season, but there is still the question of, will he face some sort of suspension from the league? Nothing has happened yet, which, leads me to believe that we might not see something until, midway through the season, which would be kind of, would be a bummer for everyone to not just have that knocked out at the beginning of the year. But Xavier Worthy, by all accounts, has been good so far. He's certainly now with Hollywood Brown missing some time, has a chance to really establish himself, as, an upper echelon player on this offense. So I love the potential. Obviously, he's got, Patrick Mahomes. I would take, I think, McConkey second on this list. I think that he has an opportunity to develop into, a long-term number 1 receiver, but I think it is very, very close between the other 3 here with Thomas and Coleman as well. But I've said repeatedly throughout the offseason that I think Khalil Shakir is the wide receiver to own in Buffalo, at least if you're trying to get immediate value in 2024. So I do think that dampens Keon Coleman. And then likewise, I have also preferred Christian Kirk over Brian Thomas for 2024 in Jacksonville. So, and I guess at the same time, I've also preferred Josh Palmer to be the wide receiver 1 in Los Angeles. So there's some obvious upside with each of these players, but I do think there is some solid competition all the way around. And Xavier Worthy, to me, still has the highest ceiling. And so that is why he was at the top for me, and Twitter concurred. So our next group of players is another set of wide receivers, but this time it's a group of veterans. And Chris Godwin, Christian Watson, and Hollywood Brown all went back to back to back in the 10th round of the startup draft. Godwin went at the 10:03, Watson the 10:04, and Brown at the 10:05. And this, I think, is one of the more difficult questions because, to me, Chris Godwin and Christian Watson are the clear top two of this trio to me. However, all three, I think, slipped a bit in the draft. I was really hoping that either Godwin or Watson was going to fall to me in the 11th. That obviously, later in the 10th. I think I was picking at 10:07 in that round. And, that obviously was not the case. But Chris Godwin is somebody that I think possesses a lot of short-term upside. For 2024, he was able to stay healthy for last season. He's going to be back in the slot, should be a little bit more involved, and I think return to being a more effective player in that role compared to, playing more on the outside last season. And then Christian Watson, to me, is sort of this ultimate, high ceiling, low floor type of player because we've seen, him being a deep threat, a touchdown guy, kind of an ambiguous offense in terms of that receiver room as to who's going to step up and be the number one. I think it's going to be Watson as long as he stays healthy. So given the age factor and being tied to Jordan Love, there's a lot to like there. So to me, it would be a 50-50 toss-up between Godwin and Watson as to who I would prefer. And I think it entirely depends on your roster construction. And if you really need to count on one of these guys to, hold down a starting spot in your lineup or not, or if you have some other depth. So for me and my team in this particular league, I probably would have preferred Watson because I already had a whole lot of receiver depth. And so I wouldn't have been forced into having to start him at the beginning of the season. Whereas if I was a team that had gone a little bit more running back heavy, or just spread things out a little bit and hadn't really concentrated on receiver, Chris Godwin would probably have been the guy that I would have taken there. And then Hollywood Brown, I think, is a bit of a distant third here. Granted, there was the injury news that came out this past weekend here, and we don't exactly know when he's going to return. It sounds like it could be, about a month that he misses. So he should be fine still for most of the regular season, but he his status for week 1 will be in doubt. I think he went in the right spot in the draft. I think that Godwin and Watson fell too far. I would have taken them a full round earlier. However, Hollywood Brown, I still think has some juice left in the tank. And if he can stay healthy, could be in for a solid season with Kansas City. But obviously the situation now has changed. And so I think that these percentages would even be a little bit different if I had, started running this poll today, as opposed to a few days ago. But Twitter agreed that Godwin and Watson were the top two. 39% of voters preferred Chris Godwin, 38% preferred Christian Watson, and then 23% said that they would take Hollywood Brown of this group. Our last set of players here that I want to talk about is Josh Palmer and Jakobi Meyers. So two players who, these guys went back-to-back. Palmer went at the last pick of the 13th round, and Meyers went with the first pick of the 14th round. So, sort of interesting scenarios. Palmer a little bit younger. Meyers maybe has more of a steadier track record of production, but he's, on a worse offense. There's, Devontae Adams is there. Brock Bowers is added to the equation. And I was involved in this. I took Jakobi Meyers at 1401. And I was very unhappy to do so, to be frank. I really wanted Josh Palmer with that pick. That's who I'd been targeting all throughout the draft, that I wanted Josh Palmer in that spot. I had acquired the 1401 in an earlier trade, as I was able to move up in the 14th round, as part of, an earlier deal that I believe involved the, some 5th and 6th round picks changing hands. And I really wanted that Palmer Herbert stack. You guys know, if you've been listening to these shows, that I have been very much in on guys like Josh Palmer and Christian Watson and some various other names throughout the offseason. And I was unfortunately unable to come away with Josh Palmer here. I did offer some trades for later in the draft to try to just move up, that one spot, get that pick. But it either somebody else, listening to the podcast and, is excited for Josh Palmer like I am, or they just, independent thinker that also happen to really like Josh Palmer. So, Twitter, though, does not agree with me, at least doesn't agree with what I had wanted to happen. They agreed with who I ended up landing on my team. 56% of voters said that they would prefer Jakobi Meyers over Josh Palmer, who received 44% of the vote. So I don't see it that way, but I do think that is because Ladd McConkey is probably the Chargers player that the majority believes will finish as the team's number one receiver. And certainly the Herbert injury could affect this as well. So, if Easton Stick or someone else ends up having to start games for the Chargers, that is certainly going to hurt, the entire Chargers receiver core. And so in that sense, we know that the quarterback play is going to be mediocre no matter who it is in Vegas, whether it's, O'Connell or Gardner Minshew, whatever the situation turns out to be, probably not going to be great. However, there is the potential upside of a Devontae Adams trade that would open up even more targets for Jakobi Meyers, who has been, almost surprisingly consistent over the past few years. So for me, this was a situation where I needed to add a bench wide receiver. Meyers will probably be my first, bye-week fill-in guy that I look to plug into my lineup, when I need to. And Palmer would have been that same sort of player for me. So similar role for my fantasy team, but I was a bit bummed to not end up with my guy. So there you have it. Those are the 8 players. We'll have a little bit of a shorter episode today, and I'm going to try to keep things somewhere in this 30 to 40 minute range here moving forward, instead of some of these longer shows that we've had throughout the summer, breaking down the various divisions. And I have tweeted out the entire first 10 rounds of the startup draft. So that is on the Dynasty War Room Twitter, or X account as it is also known. That's at Dynasty War Room. So go check that out if you want to see those first 10 rounds all listed out. But just to cover some bases here, I will share the first 2 rounds here for those of you who are not on Twitter but are interested in seeing how some of those decisions turned out. So Patrick Mahomes went first overall in this draft. Josh Allen went second. Jalen Hurts third. CJ Stroud 4. Lamar Jackson 5. Justin Jefferson, the first non-quarterback off the board, to myself with the 6th pick. Anthony Richardson at the 107. Bijan Robinson at 108. Jamar Chase at the 109. CeeDee Lamb at the 110. I was surprised to see him slip down to 10. Caleb Williams at the 111. Joe Burrow at the 112. Amon-Ra St. Brown at 201. Marvin Harrison 202. Christian McCaffrey went at the 203 in a big trade-up scenario there to land McCaffrey to go with Patrick Mahomes. Garrett Wilson in another trade-up went at the 204. Breece Hall at the 205. Jahmyr Gibbs at the 206. Justin Herbert at the 207. A.J. Brown at the 208. Jordan Love and Kyler Murray back-to-back at the 209 and 210, followed by Sam Laporta at the 211, and then Puka Nacua at the 212. So pretty, interesting first 2 rounds there. I don't have a lot of major disagreements. I think that my favorite pick of the first round was probably, the 10th overall pick ending up as CeeDee Lamb. The fact that for me it was a pretty close call between Jefferson and Lamb for the 6th pick. Lamb sticking around a few extra picks, I think, is really good value. I've talked about Amon-Ra St. Brown being, a pick that I really love there. The first pick of the 2nd round to go with Joe Burrow. I think that there's some really good quarterback value that went in the second round. All three players, I would have been perfectly happy with any of them on my squad. I did land Herbert, but Love and Murray as well in the back half of the second, I think is really good value in a Superflex league. And I don't know that there were any huge, question marks for me. I personally would not have taken Christian McCaffrey at the 203, but it's also difficult to bet against McCaffrey given just how much of a unicorn he is. I think that taking a running back at his age is not something I would have done in the second round. But again, you're going to pair him with Patrick Mahomes. It's a win now scenario. This drafter went with a lot of veterans, so it's clearly a win now. See what I can do this year, and if it doesn't work, you'll figure it out in the future. Kept all of his rookie picks, so just interesting how everyone has a different strategy, and we've seen that throughout drafts in all leagues. But certainly some interesting moves here. There was a team that through trades did not have a first round pick, but they had a series of second and third round picks. And they went back-to-back running back in the second round with Breece Hall and Jahmyr Gibbs together on the same team instead of taking one of those three quarterbacks of Herbert, Love, and Murray, which I thought was an interesting move. And so that's pretty much the quick and dirty takeaways from this startup draft. And with that, we will sign off and talk to you all again next week. We're going to talk a little bit more with a focus on 2024, talk about players who can finish at number 1 overall at their position groups, players that you really should be targeting if you're in redraft leagues or looking to make a win now move in Dynasty. So we're going to take a look at those on next week's show. But for now, thank you all very much for tuning in. You've been listening to the Dynasty War Room podcast, and we will talk to you all next week.